Do you think too little of yourself? Hi, James Hands here from Awaken Therapy. It's a very common thing for people who've been through significant trauma, particularly in childhood, but this could also be adult situations of being mistreated or domestic violence, this sort of thing. It's pretty obvious why we would come out of these experiences with a low self-esteem, low self-worth, just basically thinking in a small way about ourselves. And so let's unpack this a bit. Perhaps you've been through some significant challenges in your life, probably have if you're watching this. I'm so sorry that happened to you. And if it was early in particular, when we're forming as a child, our sense of self, our identity, obviously our self-worth, self-esteem, that's all very delicate, that's all very fragile and vulnerable. And it's forming in those years when we're usually dependent on parents. And so sometimes the abuse is just so horrific that we're told that we're no good, we're told we're bad, we're told we're worthless, we're told we're a piece of shit or whatever. And of course, that gets internalized. My father was very critical, never a word of praise, always critical, never good enough. So the messaging in that obviously was very negative, very hard to form a good sense of self out of that. I've had to work through my life to heal that out and have a better sense of self, which I do now. But often the messaging is coming from the behaviour. So think of a child who the language might be, oh, we love you, we're good parents, blah, blah, blah. But the behaviour might be different. Maybe there's a lot of neglect. Maybe the child's ignored. Maybe there's a significant emotional neglect where the child is never understood. There's a lack of empathy. And so these behaviours, these ways we're being treated as a child are basically the message. The behaviour is the message, and that speaks louder than words. And the message, of course, is that, oh, well, you're not interesting. We don't care about you. You're not valuable. You don't, earn our love, so there must be something wrong with you. And of course, that all gets internalized. And so it is standard for the neglected child to come out of childhood with a strong sense of inadequacy. And this obviously causes all sorts of problems. And if we're talking about active abuse, if we're talking about being mistreated, if we're talking about, physical, sexual, whatever abuse, or growing up with a lot of conflict, violence, all this sort of horrendous life challenge stuff that we seem to take on, if it's being acted out in these physical ways, of course the messaging in that is so loud and clear, isn't it? And this is why coming out of trauma leads to a chronic sense of, not good enough. And this manifests in things like inner critic, outer critic. We could do a whole other video on this, but basically that's the internalized message that we're not good enough, and that kind of repeats as a scratched record. I like to go a bit beyond that in my work. I like to see that too as a protective part where our inner critic wants to get in first. If we put ourselves down first, that feels a bit less painful than waiting and getting it from somewhere else. We have a bit more control in that. So that's another interesting aspect of the healing work. But key in this is you. Key in this is adult you. That's the key. That's the kind of magic ingredient in all of this, because you're not just the child. Or perhaps you're not just the adult still stuck in a violent situation or an abusive situation. However you've managed to survive that, however you've managed to drag yourself through the awful times where you've done it, that's the first great act of courage of the soul warrior, is to actually get through these things. And even if your self-concept is completely battered and bruised and even broken, well, you're still here, aren't you? And that's your superpower, just the fact that you're here as the adult. Now, of course, as you've been following my videos, if you know what I'm about, you'll know that we also want to plug into the spiritual level. We want to expand that out to the greater self, because once we plug back into our soul and all that our soul is part of, which is the whole spirit world, right back to perfect love. Once we plug into that, we can bring that truth, that love, that light, that wisdom, that power into our healing work through the adult. Even if you're not quite plugged into that yet, I think you probably are, but even if you're not spiritual per se, the adult you has all these superpowers that we don't have as a child. And so when you bring those superpowers with you, you bring your rational mind, you bring your adult maturity, even mid-20s, late 20s. Certainly a lot of my clients are in that sweet spot, late 30s, early 50s. That seems to be the sweet spot in terms of maturity and growth and development to be ready to go back and do our trauma work. It's like we need enough differential there to be able to tolerate going back into that pain. But think of what you do. Think of who you are today. Even on your worst day, you're a superhero compared to the child and the very limited resources we have as a kid. So this part of you that thinks too little of yourself, well, that might be echoed and repeated there through adult life, and the adult you might still think you're a piece of shit, excuse me. But a part of you knows that that's not true. A part of you knows that you've survived. Part of you has probably accumulated some good evidence over the years that, oh, maybe I'm not just a piece of shit. Gee, I've been able to do that well, or I've raised a child or children better than I was treated, maybe hugely better. Well, that's remarkable. Or maybe you've expressed it through work or through some sort of giving or sharing or caring in whatever way. There's unlimited ways that this can be expressed. But there must be a part of you that knows you have some value. Maybe it's become quite healthy. And whatever, whether it's kind of 1% or 100%, you've got some leverage here. So I invite you as the adult you to actually write down 3 things you like about yourself. We don't have to use the love word just yet if that's a bit overwhelming, but even just the like. Oh, look, I'm not so, unhappy about this part of me, or I'm kind of maybe a bit slightly proud of this part of me, or actually, I really like this quality about me. And to write it down, see it on a page is a very helpful way of reinforcing it, making it more conscious. And so this is the leverage we want. You bring these elements of self-worth, self-love, self-acceptance then to the child. And there's different ways we can do that. We can journal that, we can draw that, we can paint that, we can reflect on that. If you know me, I love hypnotherapy because when we drop in our consciousness, we get down into the subconscious mind, which is where we're living from as a child. That's the level of brainwave activity, if you like, that we live from as a child. As an adult, we'd call it the subconscious. As a child, well, that's our conscious awareness. It's very direct, it's very immediate, it's very visual, it's imagination, basically. Think of a child's imagination, imaginative world. And so when we drop in directly as the adult, bringing all your resources to the parts of you in a child's such an efficient way to get there, that are feeling crap about self, well, you can start to gently question. You can start to gently nudge and challenge and say, well, no, that's not true. You were never a bad kid. You're a great kid. They were lucky to have you. They were lucky to have you, and they just blew it. They just blew their chance. They just hadn't done their own work, hadn't healed themselves, and they just passed that on. Thanks, guys. Great job. That's them. That's on them. That's their responsibility. That's not your fault. That's not about you. And as we do this work, over time it sinks in. In fact, for the child in us, it shifts quite quickly. Children are very flexible and open. They haven't rusted in like we rust in as adults. There's much more openness. And so in that openness, in that flexibility, we get really very efficient shifts. And as the child inside is reparented into a self-worth, self-love, self-value, which is fair enough, that's appropriate, that's how it, your inner child should feel about themselves. They deserve to feel that way. As you correct it and heal him or her into that state, then that feels different in the adult. You'll find a really dramatic, deep, subtle yet powerful shift in how you feel, how you operate as the adult. And that's exciting, and that's permanent change. That's genuine healing, because that's real, it's happened on the foundational levels, and that just flows through into the present day expressions of who and what we are. So I encourage you to keep on your healing journey, to seek professional help if you haven't already, explore different modalities that support, but at the core of it, I'd really invite you just to find some excuses to like yourself, find some reasons to love yourself, and then bring those reasons, bring that knowing, bring that sense of worth through to the inner child, and that'll change your life.